Welcome everybody to the IISS for today's meeting on Russia-EU gas relations and with also a focus on Ukraine. It's a topic that has never been very far from the headlines since 2006 with the first crisis and then 2009 with a more serious one that left much of southeastern Europe without gas in the midst of winter. And now we are perhaps on the verge of another crisis with Ukraine owing a reported $3.5 billion, having missed the May 7th deadline for repayment and the prospect of a switch to prepayment starting June, hoving into view depending on a meeting next week. My colleague Pierre Noël is the ISS Senior Fellow for Energy Security. He's based in an office in Singapore. So it's nice to have the opportunity to put him on stage on his rare visits to London these days. Before that, he was at Cambridge University with the Electricity and Energy Policy Research Group. And he will speak for approximately 20 to 30 minutes now, and we'll have the rest of the time for Q&A. Without further ado, could I ask you please, if you have a phone, to at least switch it onto mute, and I'll hand over to Pierre.
Thank you very much, Nick. I'm very pleased to be here. I joined IISS a bit more than a year ago, but Nick said I'm based in Singapore, so it's my first opportunity to speak in London, in Arundel House, and I'm very pleased to be here. I understand the format is essentially a lunch meeting without lunch, so I suppose it creates an incentive to wrap it up quite quickly. But we're nonetheless going to take the time we need to go through some of the issues. For me, it's some sort of a pivot back to Europe. I used to work on European gas in my previous position, including with some people who are in this room, but then I converted almost completely to Asian energy issues. But then, of course, the events in Ukraine and around Ukraine brought this topic back to the very top of the headlines, and so I've been asked to go back to my analysis and some of my spreadsheets, and the outcome is, among a few other things, is this presentation. So I would like to cover three topics over the next 20 minutes. The first one focuses on Ukraine, and it's about the energy, and more specifically natural gas, causes and implications of what's going on in Ukraine and between Russia and Ukraine. The second topic is about gas supply security in Europe, because actually, as you've seen, there's been a lot of debates triggered by the events in Ukraine about gas security in Europe, even though, for now at least, there's not been any direct or indirect implications for Europe of what's going on between Russia and Ukraine. So I want to spend a few minutes on that. And the third and final topic I'm going to cover is the broader subject of the Russia-EU gas relationship and what the current events may mean for its future. So starting with the causes and energy causes and consequences of the events in Ukraine. I think the main message here is that, contrary perhaps to a lot of the talk that has been going on in the media and even from politicians, senior politicians in Europe and even in the US, the basic situation is not Russia blackmailing Ukraine, but the basic situation since Ukraine's independence is Ukraine blackmailing Russia to extract very significant economic rent, essentially out of Ukraine's monopoly over transit of Russian gas to Europe. So Ukraine managed to get cheap gas, and for a long time, very cheap gas. And by the way, as Nick mentioned in his introductory remarks, has, since independence, always paid for only part of what it consumed. This fraction actually went up and down and up and down. But on top of getting cheap gas, Ukraine has never really paid in full. But it offered also in this deal, it offered relatively cheap transit to Russia for its gas. After 2000, the price of oil went up sharply, and that was reflected directly in the prices of natural gas in Europe, as most of the natural gas consumed in Europe at the time at least was indexed on oil, and most of it is still, a very large part of it is still indexed on oil. So the price of gas in Europe rose very, very quickly after 2000. But this was not reflected in the prices that Ukraine paid for Russian gas. However, after a few years, this subsidy to Ukraine became so large that Gazprom, of course, demanded that the prices in Ukraine started rising to reflect the increase in the price of oil, and therefore the sort of true economic value of gas. And Ukraine managed to refuse that. I mean, had the means to refuse that because it used, and some would say abused, its position as a monopoly transit provider. And the logic of this bargaining was the following: implicitly, or perhaps even explicitly, in the negotiations, Ukraine told Russia, and especially Gazprom, well, if you cut us off because we don't want to pay what you ask, or because you demand that we pay back our debt, if you cut us off, we're going to take gas out of the transit pipelines, and the European consumers at the other end of the pipelines will blame you, Russia, especially after the 2004-5 so-called Orange Revolution, where Ukraine was perceived, and I'm not denying it was, but was perceived as an emerging democracy which was trying to extract itself from a situation of political dependence on Russia, and maybe to try and make other geostrategic choices. And in that political context, any cutting off of Ukraine by Russia would be perceived as the emerging democracy being bullied by the anti-democratic regime that is its sole gas supplier. So Ukraine played a very skillful game of blackmailing Russia, and especially Gazprom, extracting huge economic rent, taking European gas consumers as hostage in its negotiation with Russia. So it was very, very well done, I would say. But of course, was increasingly difficult to accept from the Russian perspective. In January 2006, as Nick alluded to, the first crisis erupted, and Russia refused to back down, and when the contract expired at the very end of 2005, stopped supplying Ukraine, which immediately started stealing into the pipelines, and after 2-3 days, the Russia backed down, and gas started flowing again. In the meantime, things played exactly as expected. Europe and the US and everybody in between blamed Russia for bullying the aspiring democracy in Ukraine. 3 years later, 3 years later to the day, in January 2009, the exact same sequence happened, and this time Russia did not back down, and there was an unprecedented and perhaps unthinkable until then. Interruption in the gas supply relationship between Russia, Ukraine, and Europe. The Ukrainian transit corridor was shut down entirely for 2 weeks and was disrupted in total for 3 weeks, but shut down entirely for 2 weeks, which is perhaps the largest disruption of a commercial energy relationship in the world ever. And this crisis was resolved when Ukraine signed and had to sign a contract that completed the catching up process with the European prices. So in 2009, Ukraine signed a 10-year contract with Gazprom that settled both the price formula for the gas that they consume and the tariff for gas transit through Ukraine. And from now onwards, Ukraine was supposed to pay the equivalent of European prices. But this crisis also had another impact, which is extremely important. It cemented Russia's decision, willingness to bypass Ukraine as a transit country. This process started actually way before that. But Russia's resolve and Russia's diplomatic investment into the bypassing of Ukraine was sharply accelerated and deepened and hardened by the 2006 and 2009 crisis. I must say that several European countries, those who are the largest clients of Gazprom in Europe, draw the exact same conclusion from those two crises. I mean, in front of journalists, they expressed support for Ukraine in the crisis, but actually behind that, they organized themselves to become active partners of Russia and Gazprom in bypassing Ukraine. And this is the root cause of the situation we are in now. So, cheap energy allowed Ukraine not to reform. I think it's very important to understand that Ukraine is not really a transition economy. Ukraine never really started its transition. If you compare the restructuring of the industrial sectors, for example, in Ukraine and other transition economies, Ukraine looks much more like Russia than Poland, the Czech Republic, or even the Baltic states. And if you look at industry in particular, which is so important for the Ukrainian GDP, industry is extremely energy intensive and extremely energy inefficient. And industry is heavy industry, chemicals, metals, is absolutely key to Ukrainian GDP because it provides, and Ukrainian economy, because it provides such a large share of the foreign exchange earnings. So Ukraine depended on cheap energy essentially not to reform, not to go through the very painful process of economic reform. And cheap energy depended on the gas transit monopoly position. So as soon as Gazprom and their European partners' investment into bypassing Ukraine started to materialize, the transit monopoly deteriorated, disappeared, and Ukraine became much more exposed to the fundamental dilemma of having to choose between expensive energy as a condition for its political independence and cheap energy that would come at the price of political submission. If I have to summarize very crudely Ukraine's situation, I think it's exactly that. On the one hand, you pay the price that you have to pay for your, let's call it, Euro-Atlantic strategic choices, and this price would be very heavy. On the other hand, you exchange the continuation of the status quo, very cheap energy, that allows you not to reform economically, but of course it comes at the cost of, to summarize very crudely, political submission. If you remember, the Maidan Revolution started when the Yanukovych government, I would say, chose submission by turning back on the free trade or deep free trade agreement with the EU. And the fact that this precisely triggered those political events, this revolt by a large fraction of the Ukrainian people, shows that a large fraction of the population doesn't want political submission, but that doesn't mean that they are prepared to pay for their political independence. And it certainly does not mean that the EU or the IMF or the US or whoever it is prepared to bail out Ukraine permanently on a permanent basis to allow them to continue doing what they've done since independence. So essentially, the political disintegration of Ukraine, of course, is the direct outcome of Russia's foreign policy vis-à-vis Ukraine, their foreign policy actions, and the willingness and ability of Russia to exploit a fundamental weakness. But it's fundamentally the product precisely of this fundamental weakness. And the fact that the country implodes reflects the fact that it cannot make a choice. Ukraine is completely unable, because it's too divided, to make a choice between cheap energy and political submission on the one hand, expensive energy and political independence on the other hand. So I would not hesitate to be rather deterministic and to say that there is a very powerful energy reason, cause, behind the political events that are unfolding at the moment. Most of the industry, this heavy industry that's so critical for Ukraine's GDP, Ukraine's macroeconomy, most of this industry is located in the eastern provinces of Ukraine. The very provinces that are culturally, politically, religiously, linguistically close to Russia. So why would you want those people to vote for 20 years of economic hardship? They, at the same time, they are much more. They're sort of quite willing to go with Russia politically. On the one hand, at the same time, there are those who would suffer from the opposite choice, and those who benefit from cheap gas. So, in a sense, all the factors are aligned, the geographic factors are aligned for the eastern provinces to very strongly vote for some kind of political arrangement with Russia in exchange of the continuation of the status quo energetically and economically. The implications of bypassing for Ukraine are pretty dire, as you would have already guessed. And it's going to get worse, because South Stream would essentially, South Stream, as you could derive from this graph, would complete the bypassing of Ukraine. Ukraine would become redundant as a transit country. And one of the direct implications of that is that the value of the transit infrastructure will be completely written off. So you've got $20 billion roughly that is going to disappear from Naftogaz balance sheet, which means that Naftogaz essentially disappears. So this is not negligible. This is very, very important for Ukraine. Also politically, the split of the country. I'm not saying that the country is going to cease to be one country legally speaking. That I don't know, and I've got no particular expertise. But it's clear to me that the logic of the economic split of Ukraine is very powerful and unavoidable. And I've already explained that. But once the bypassing is complete, this is going to become even more powerful. As I've already alluded to, I don't think that there's a credible prospect for somebody to step and substitute for the huge rents that Ukraine has extracted from Russia over the years. I don't think that either the EU, the US, the IMF, or a combination of the three will do that on a sustainable basis. I'm not also completely certain that this would be desirable for Ukraine on a long-term perspective. Just a final thought on the bypassing of Ukraine. It's very, I think, it's even not only important but critical to understand that this is not a Russian, a unilateral Russian endeavor. This is a strategic cooperation between Europe and Russia, and for reasons that I've already mentioned, that Ukraine blackmailed Russia by taking Europe hostage in the negotiation. And if you look at how it's been done by cooperation between Russia on the one hand, Russia and Gazprom on the one hand, and Germany, Italy, and France mostly on the other hand. Of course, basic agreement at the governmental level, but very concrete financial and technical cooperation with the largest utilities in those three European countries, namely E.ON, Vingas, if I'm correct, in Germany, GDF Suez in France, EDF in France for South Stream, and of course Eni for South Stream, and Saipem on the technical side from Italy as well. So it's really a Europe-Russia cooperation to bypass Ukraine, and it raises, of course, many, quite, I would say, deep questions for Europe, because this has never been acknowledged politically. Nobody in Europe has ever come publicly and said, "Oh, we're cooperating with Russia to bypass Ukraine, and this is why we're doing that, and it's going to be done by that date." I mean, European government, even the German government, has never acknowledged that. They've always said stupid things like, "This is not about bypassing Ukraine; it's about creating new export capacity because we want to increase our intakes of Russian gas in the future." This is just completely untrue. It has always been purely to bypass Ukraine. Everybody knows that, but nobody has ever acknowledged it for obvious political reasons. But I think it doesn't help that Europe never acknowledged that. Also, the other aspect is it's never been an EU project. It's been intergovernmental cooperation between a few European governments and Russia. It's never been an EU project, and the EU has always, has never really known, and perhaps never really understood what was going on, and never really known how to handle it. I remember that at some point in Brussels, they awarded Nord Stream with some kind of privileged status, whatever it means, that they considered this infrastructure quite important for Europe. At the same time, they are fighting against South Stream, whereas it's one and the same project, and they've never had a coherent position on that. And the final thought is that nobody has ever articulated any discourse about how this interacted with our geopolitical, our foreign policy vis-à-vis Ukraine. We're creating conditions that are structurally weakening Ukraine, and at the same time we pretend to be their best friend and to help them, move towards a more independent position from Russia, I think there was a coherent discourse that could have been held, which was, we are cooperating with Russia to bypass Ukraine because we are fed up with Ukraine behavior as a transit country. It creates huge insecurity for us, Europe, and it extracts undue rents from Russia. That's one thing. On the other hand, because we're weakening Ukraine economically, Ukraine will have to get serious about reforming their economy and especially their energy industry, and we are ready to help them do that. So a combination of being much more sterner and more generous vis-à-vis Ukraine would have been a coherent strategy on the European side, but nobody ever articulated it, let alone implemented it. So finally, to complete on Ukraine, when you will remember that in 2010 and 2013, the Ukrainian government actually went back to its old habits and exchanged the renewal of the lease for the base in Crimea against a significant rebate on the price of gas. And then under Yanukovych, there was another 30% rebate. Well, that brought the price down, as it was meant to. But of course, after the recent events, those two rebates were cancelled, and Ukraine is back to the 2009 contract. And the current Ukrainian government's take on that is quite peculiar. They considered that an unjustified discriminatory price for gas, whereas it's just coming back to the contract that they signed in 2009, which essentially brought the price to the European levels. But of course, now we're ending up to the situation that Nick alluded at the very beginning, which is that Ukraine is saying that essentially they can't pay, which means that perhaps we're sort of restarting the process that led to the 2006-2009 crisis. It can happen. I don't know if it will happen. I think it also depends on Russia's short-term strategic calculations, of whether it's in their interest, they think it's in their interest to go to the crisis or not. If they go to the crisis, I think it will have as an implication to make South Stream unavoidable and sort of complete the process that I've already talked to at length. If we switch to gas security in Europe now, the first thing that I want to tell you, to remind you about, is that Europe has been diversifying its gas supply for several decades. The share of Russian gas in EU gas imports has been collapsing for 30 years, and the share of Russian gas in EU gas consumption has stabilized since the late 80s. And now it's about 35% of imports, 25% of consumption, and 6% of primary energy. And as you can see from the graph, the last two ratios are very stable and have been stable for a long time. The problem is that as far as Russian gas is concerned, the EU is not a single entity. And especially after the 2004 and 2007 enlargements, there are essentially two EUs of Russian gas, the red one and the green one on my chart. On the one hand, you have large gas markets in Western Europe, which are big clients of Gazprom, and which are also Gazprom's and Russia's historical partners in establishing this Russia-EU gas relationship back in the 70s and 80s. And on the other hand, you have the red group here, composed mainly of small Central and Eastern European gas markets, which are highly dependent on Russian gas and very wary of Russia politically for obvious historical reasons. This split is becoming worse because diversification is accelerating in Western Europe, has been accelerating quite dramatically over the past 5 years. Because of market integration in Europe, because of the fact that the UK market has been integrating very quickly and quite deeply with Northwest Europe, at the same time as it was transitioning towards LNG imports. The financial crisis also created an LNG glut on the international market, which Europe benefited a lot from. So a mix of integration and changing market conditions in Western Europe, which especially changed very considerably the German gas market. The German gas market ceased to be some sort of an island that was supplied by Russia through a kind of a bilateral relationship. It became much more part of a very large Northwest European gas market where Russia is just one supplier among others, and where there's increasing amount of competition. On Central and Eastern Europe, on the other hand, they have missed out almost completely on the globalization of European gas. Not completely, but to a large degree. They've not benefited from that. This is what I had called at the time the Iron Curtain of gas, and I think it's pretty much still in place. The European gas market on a continental basis doesn't work. There's no trading on long-distance pipelines. And this is the product of regulatory choices that have been made by the EU in the early 2000s. I don't have time to go back to that. But those choices have geopolitical implications in this context, of course. And the industrial implications of this defective European market is that Poland is building an LNG terminal, that you have an endless series of subsidized interconnector projects that are put forward by Central European governments, supported by the European Commission. A whole lot of uneconomic infrastructure that is just the reflection that gas cannot move from west to east, whereas there's no technical hurdle whatever to have a pan-European continental market for gas, but we've not been able to do that. And Central and Eastern Europe is paying a price, but Europe is paying a price in terms of its unity as well. So can this market work? Well, I don't think so. I think it would require very deep reform of gas transport regulation in Europe, and that is not on the agenda. In Northwest Europe, there has been a market emerging, as I've already said, and that reflects the fact that basically everybody is just one border away from the LNG market. It's just a one border problem. If you're in Germany, to cross to either the Netherlands or Belgium or France. If you're in France, you're directly connected to the LNG market. The UK is now a huge corridor for LNG into Northwest Europe. The interconnector between the UK and the continent works very, very well, and it's the only pipeline that is not under EU rules. So the only one that works is the only one that is not in compliance with Brussels rules, although Brussels is doing whatever they can to put it under their rules. And that is something that you should, and that Europe should fight against. But but this interconnector between the UK and Belgium has served the Northwest European market very well. In Central Europe, there's no, this European market does not extend to Central and Eastern Europe, and this is a very recent quote from Energy Commissioner Oettinger, where he basically acknowledges, perhaps without even knowing it, that their own project has completely failed. What is very interesting here, and shows the level of complete confusion of those people at the very top echelon of the European Commission, is they demand the outcome of a market, even though there's no market. They demand that Russia sells gas at the same price in Lithuania and in France, even if in France there's a lot of competition against Russian gas, and in Lithuania there's none. So of course, if there was a European market, Gazprom would be forced by the market to sell at the same price everywhere. But it is not a market failure, or it is not an abuse of dominant position that Gazprom sells gas at a higher prices where there's no competition. Whereas there's no market, they have to index it on oil, as everywhere, as in Japan or South Korea or Singapore or wherever you want. Where there is a market, they eventually have to sell it at the market price. But the European Commission now demands that Gazprom sells at the same price as if there was a market. So it's very interesting. They fail to create a market, and they demand the outcome of a market, which I think, shows that there's serious problems in Brussels. So, can Central and Eastern Europe have gas security if the market cannot work? Yes, the answer is yes, yes, yes. They can have gas security, and they can have gas security through a mix of the following. They can have passive gas security. They can spend some money into increasing the resilience of their energy systems to large-scale disruptions of their energy imports from Russia. Some of them have done it, some of them have not, but all of them can do it. And the calculations we had done, and I'm pleased that Florent Sylve is in the room, in the calculations we had done in Cambridge, where we have done some very detailed work on that, showed that most of those countries can have a very decent level of resilience for a very small security premium, in exchange, in other words, of a fairly small tax on gas. The fact that they don't do it reflects some political economy problem, because their gas companies could lose, or reflects the fact that they prefer to bargain with the EU for subsidies to do this or to do that, as opposed to addressing their own problem, and also reflects, because that's the other option, they could contract their way out of Russian gas. Almost all of them could, through existing infrastructure. For some of them, they would have to build new infrastructure and finance it through the contracts, but they could contract their way out of Russian gas completely. But that would require a single buyer scheme, which is forbidden under EU law. That's the very basic of the European Gas Directive. So I think Brussels has become a significant part of the problem in Central and Eastern Europe, but everybody perceives it as a significant part of the solution. If you take the Baltic states or Poland, they are embarking on building LNG terminals, but those, at the same time, they are already over-contracted with Gazprom. And when the contracts reach the end, Gazprom slashes the prices, makes it completely uneconomic to contract for LNG. So they can't, there is a missing, there's a contracting problem. What they should do is exactly what Singapore is doing. Singapore is transitioning towards LNG and away from pipeline gas supply. But for that, they created a single buyer, gave it a 20-year monopoly franchise, so that the Singaporean gas consumers, their consumption can be translated into a long-term LNG contract. Well, that is completely forbidden under EU law. So this could be another solution that they cannot implement. And I had a third point, but I think it's better that I stop here. I've already said a lot of things. I just want maybe very briefly to say that, to summarize it in 2 sentences, I believe that the bypassing of Ukraine on the one hand and the transformations of these Northwest European markets on the other hand, which have Europeanized the large import contracts of Russian gas, those 2 developments actually create conditions for a new era in the Russia-EU gas relationship. I think after 10 years of mounting tensions and misunderstandings and I have to say resistance, strong resistance from Gazprom to adapt to the changing market realities, I think the situation now is perhaps settling. But the paradox is that if you listen to what's the political noise coming from Germany, people seem to really resent and they don't like at all what they see happening in Ukraine. So there's essentially 2 options, and I'm not going to choose between the 2. I think the fundamental conditions are in place for a new normal, let's say, in the Russia-EU gas relationship. On the other hand, it's not completely impossible that European governments, I mean the traditional partners of Russia in Europe, especially Germany, are now coming to a point where they've completely lost trust in Russia and may embark into some sort of a crash energy policy to move away from their gas relationship with Russia. If I had to put probabilities, I think that the first option is much more probable, but I don't think that the second one is impossible. Of course, whether the political situation on the ground, whether the political new normal in Ukraine, to use the phrase that my colleague Sam Sharap has been using recently, whether the new normal in Ukraine is very ugly or just slightly ugly may have may actually be a deciding factor in whether this gas relationship will continue on the new basis or not. I've spoken for longer than I thought I would, but I really look forward to your questions and to the discussion. Thank you.
Pierre, thank you very much. So we've ranged quite broadly there, the specifics of the Russia-Ukraine gas relationship, the question of whether the European Commission, the left hand and the right hand, knows what they're doing in terms of energy policy and strategic interests, and then some broader questions in the European energy mix. I invite you now to put your questions. If I'd ask you please to state your name and affiliation before you do so. You, sir, caught my eye first. Just a moment, wait for the microphone, please.
Thank you. Vinod Kumar, member of this institute. Well, my question is, this is one of the most insightful papers I've heard at the IISS in many years. My question is, you mentioned the South Streaming as a way of bypassing Ukrainian transit facilities. What exactly is it and how does it operate? Thank you.
Yes, thank you for your comment. And for your question, okay, South Stream is a large subsea pipeline that would go through the Black Sea from Russia to, as currently planned, Bulgaria, and then would have a long onshore section from Bulgaria across Southeast Europe, with a branch into Italy and a branch into Austria and the Austrian gas hub of Baumgarten. Yes. So if you take the capacity of South Stream as it is quoted by its sponsors, which are Gazprom, Eni of Italy, and EDF of France, and perhaps additional partners are coming to the project. But if you take the capacity at face value, it would completely it would complete the bypassing of Ukraine. The Russia-Europe gas relationship would no longer rely on Ukraine at all, and could be served by the three bypassing pipelines: Nord Stream under the Baltic Sea, Yamal Europe through Belarus and Poland, which came online in the mid-1990s, and South Stream.
Thank you. We have a gentleman here, please, second row.
Thank you very much. Japanese journalist Masato Kimura. My question is related to football. And so Manchester City won football.
Football, okay. Oh, I mean,
Do you know Manchester City and Chelsea? I would like to discuss. So Chelsea is not so strong as the past with Mourinho, and so the payment to Manchester City is now beyond the New York Yankees. And so what Ukraine crisis cause, or in the future Chelsea will be back on the top of Premier League. And next question is about Gazprom. Champions League sponsor this year is Gazprom, and it means Gazprom needs European consumers. But actually Putin is very aggressive, and I think the European Union way back from Russian gas. And so what do you think Putin think?
Just question two, I think.
Yes, well, I don't know. Russia is perhaps scoring own goals, you say? That's I know. What was question two?
Well, it was.
So Chelsea depends on Abramovich.
No. Question two.
question two.
Question two.
Is so Gazprom.
Oh, needs clients in Europe. Okay. Yes. Well, right. Okay. Well, I'm Gazprom is a very large supplier of natural gas to Europe writ large, and they have a marketing strategy that includes some of what you've described. And of course, they're not planning as if this relationship is going to collapse in the next 12 months, which I think is extremely unlikely. Anyways, I don't have a lot of things to say, but I'm not surprised that Gazprom is, trying to raise the profile of their brand and trying to normalize, in a sense, in the European context.
Thank you. Lucy, next one over here, please, and then we go down the end.
IISS member Vipul Thakur. If the US were to expedite exports of energy after congressional elections later on this year, how would it affect the Russian revenue? Because apparently it would reduce dependence on Russian gas, and there would be more energy supplies in the market. If it were so, I think it would also help, because then that would reduce revenue earned by Saudi Arabia and others in energy, and that would be good for the democracies.
Okay. In the long term, the natural gas exports from North America are going to have an impact, and have already, to some extent have already had an impact, because the fact that the US was thought to be a very large importer of LNG just 10 years ago, the fact that this did not materialize is a huge blow to Gazprom, perhaps the largest blow they've ever taken and they will ever take. But US exports of LNG would be part of the competition against Russian gas in the long term. But I think there's a bit of a misunderstanding. The U.S. government doesn't decide what's going to be exported. The U.S. government allow people to start building export infrastructure, which is completely different. What is going to be effectively exported depends on, the cost of and hence the price of gas in North America when the infrastructure is up and running, compared to the price of gas in Europe and Asia, and nobody knows what it is. Nobody knows what it is. Some people bet that it's going to be low, hence very profitable to export, and some people say that's nonsense, and the long-run marginal cost is much closer to $6, $7, $8 per million BTU as opposed to 3 currently, and so there's going to be a lot of infrastructure and no exports. I just don't know what the answer is. Nobody knows. So the other point is that the willingness to pay for LNG is much higher in Asia than it is in Europe, precisely because there's no Gazprom for Asia. There's no source of relatively cheap gas with amortized infrastructure to deliver it, and gas is still displacing a lot of oil in Asia, a job that has been fully done in Europe long ago. So, U.S. exports, you should expect it to go primarily to Asia rather than Europe. That being said, that would also free some LNG from the Middle East and Africa for Europe. So it would have an impact. But so I think you should conceive of that as a long-term dynamics completely driven by relative economics as opposed to a short-term dynamics driven by geopolitics.
Thank you. The gentleman, penultimate row in the aisle on the left. Can I ask those who also want to ask questions to keep their hands up for a moment, just so I can say I've got you all?
Hello, my name is Mark Champion. I'm from Bloomberg View. I had just 2 quick questions for you. One is, I was with your analysis all the way until the end, where the price analysis, where you were talking about you didn't understand why the Ukrainians were upset about the $500 price, and that is simply rising back to European price levels. But my understanding was that the average European price is now $380, which includes the cost of transit across Ukraine. So the effective price would be somewhat lower than that, maybe another $50 lower, which is quite a substantial difference between the average European price and the price that Ukraine is being asked to pay. So it would look, whatever the circumstances of the contract that they signed in 2009 or 10, I forget now, that Tymoshenko was sent to jail for, that it would look as though that is a rather punitive price. And the second question was just about interconnectors. It was very interesting what you had to say about the fact that it's not really working, and perhaps isn't a sensible solution for the Eastern Europeans to rely on. And I was just wondering if you could elaborate on, why what seems to be sort of common sense, that if you can connect up those Western economies in which there is now a gas market to the Eastern ones where they're still reliant on a monopoly supplier, why that wouldn't solve their problems and why it can't be done. Thank you.
Well, two very interesting questions. The first one is easy, the second one is a bit more tricky. But the first, the average price in Europe that you quote reflects the fact that Russian gas faces competition in Europe. The average European price simply doesn't have to be the price that Ukraine pays for Russian gas. If you could bring spot priced LNG to Ukraine, then the price of Russian gas in Ukraine would go down. But you can't. That's the whole thing about the absence of a pan-European market for gas transport, because the problem is that you can't trade transport capacity across long distances in Europe as you can in North America. So it's misleading to say, and I know it's everywhere in the news because there's been so much PR done by Central and Eastern European governments about, we're paying too much for gas. But look at the markets where you actually can bring alternatives to the market, like the Czech Republic, for example. The Czech Republic, went from essentially Ukrainian prices to German prices in 5 years. That would happen in Ukraine if you could bring alternatives. So the price, the $500. Yes, the contract they signed in 2009 was slightly expensive. I mean, the way the precise formula for indexing on oil is slightly less advantageous to Ukraine than the traditional European contracts. But this is not a large difference. The price that Ukraine currently pays is the price that Germany would have paid if there had been no integration between the Northwest European markets, and if the LNG that comes to the UK could not end up in German storages and be contracted for by German industrial consumers. The second question, the thing is, there is a lot of gas transport capacity between the west and the east of Europe. It's precisely the pipelines that bring Russian gas to Europe. You can trade both directions in those pipelines. Most of the time, gas would flow east to west anyway, but that's irrelevant. You can do backhaul transactions, as they do all the time in North America. And this is not done except marginally. So, for example, you have to take very concrete examples. There's a very large LNG terminal near Venice. I don't know how you say that in English. Venice. In Italy. Well, this is very, very close to the big pipeline that takes Russian gas to Italy, across Austria, with a branch into Slovenia, a branch into Hungary, although that particular branch is heavily congested. But there's simply no trade. I mean, if you are an electricity producer in the far corner of Austria or Hungary, you simply cannot trade through this LNG terminal. You cannot sign a Qatari contract or get a spot cargo from Algeria through the Italian terminal. If you were in North America, you would do that. This is why I say this interconnector thing completely misses the point. The point is to make the pipelines that exist work for a pan-European market. And that is what the European policy process, to put it like that, has completely failed to do over the past 15 years. So they built an interconnector between Romania and Hungary, which is dry, because Hungary, which regulates the price of gas against the EU law, would forbid exports anyway, and the price in Romania is much lower than Hungary, so the water will not run uphill. So this pipeline simply doesn't serve any purpose. On the other hand, you've got an LNG terminal in Greece that could very easily help Bulgaria diversify or even move completely away from Russian gas, and that is absolutely not doable. So again, you take Poland and Germany. The fact that Poland, after all these years, cannot structure backhaul transactions along the Yamal-Europe pipeline, which is a 30 BCM, 30 billion cubic meter a year pipeline, is very difficult to understand. I mean, it's a complete failure of European policy making. So yes, you can build a small interconnector with EU subsidies between the Czech Republic and Poland, but that's irrelevant. That's emphasizing the tree and missing the forest.
Okay. Final question, sir. You, please.
Charles Vivian, a member of the Institute. Thank you very much for a most intriguing presentation. Could I ask you to expand on the political dimensions of the relationship between Russia and Ukraine in the energy sector, and the extent to which you feel that Ukraine couldn't reform its economy despite the benefits it had of the discounted energy from Russia?
On the politics of that, my knowledge is very thin. I mean, frankly, I'm not a Ukraine specialist and I'm not a Russia specialist. I mean, the internal politics and the bilateral political dynamics is really not part of my expertise, and I don't want to go into that. But what I just want to perhaps try to elaborate on is the cheap gas is precisely what allowed Ukraine not to reform. You know, it's not that Ukraine did not reform despite cheap gas. Is if they had not had cheap gas, they would have had to reform. It's one of those very tricky situations where, how do you say in English? You know, necessity is exactly, or in French we say nécessité fait loi. You know, the necessity is the law in a sense. The industrial structure of all the countries that eventually joined the EU, I mean, they've been profoundly transformed. Not in a small part, not exclusively because of that, but not in small part because the price of energy was multiplied by 2, 3, 4, 5 when they embarked on their transition process. That was very painful, but that's exactly the point. You know, this is what Ukraine did not do because they did not have to do it, and it overlaps. When I discovered that, I mean, I discovered that thanks to another former colleague of mine at Cambridge, Kong Cheong, who is a very, very good specialist of energy in Ukraine. As the name doesn't say, he is Ukrainian. But I learned that from him. You know, this heavy industrial base of Ukraine is in the eastern provinces. So in the provinces that speak Russian, you know, think Russian, or are, you know, culturally very close to Russia. So it makes the whole political economy of energy and reform completely intractable politically. I hope it sort of goes some distance in answering your point, but I can't go deeper into the politics because I really don't know enough.
I'm terribly sorry, we're out of time. Shame, I imagine we could have gone on for another half an hour. I'd ask you just to join me in thanking Pierre very much.
Thank you.